Yeah, so just if you're here to see the talk titled "Everything They Told Me About Security Was Wrong," everything I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with the title "Everything They Told Me About Security Was Wrong." Well, maybe there's a loose affiliation, so if you want to go listen to Chris Nickerson or Bruce Potter, I won't be offended. I'll explain more once the talk. So just a tip, if you're co-presenting with someone and they don't show up, that gives you like carte blanche to like say whatever you want about them. So just saying. Not that anyone would do that to me, John Strand. Bastard. So yeah, John's flights, they actually couldn't get him here. Well, they could. He would have had to flown standby on 2 different flights in order to get here, like this morning. The best they could do was like get him here tonight, but that was like after everything. And they could like barely get him home. So just a tip, if you're in New York, LaGuardia is probably not the best airport to fly out of. If you want to get anywhere, I guess. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I'm PaulIs. This is John Strand. And it's funny, I had a cardboard cutout of Larry, and has anyone seen the cardboard cutout Larry? Okay, and you still have your eyeballs because you haven't gouged them out. That's awesome. I didn't make a cardboard cutout of John, but I'm thinking now of making one for everyone in the Paul.com crew just for times like this. So. Yeah, so we were supposed to give a presentation called "Everything They Told Me About Security Was Wrong." John had these fantastic slides that were all done in Prezi, and they were just like random images and like text that would come up, and it was beautiful, but I had no idea what he was going to say about the slides. So instead, you get to hear random shit that Paul's going to talk about. So hopefully, it'll be entertaining. So as I said, John Strand can't be here, and my son's new nickname for him is now Poopy Head. It's kind of funny. My wife actually texted me that picture like this morning. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. I need stuff for my presentation. That's awesome. So, yeah, Poopy Head. At one time, I did actually have a physical speaking handicap, and I always seem to apply that same handicap to all of my presentations. That's especially true today. So that was me about a week out of ACL surgery speaking at Source Boston. Not recommended, by the way. I think I'd rather have the speaking handicap I have today, which is I just have random slides. So my day job is I'm the product evangelist. That basically means I get to use all of Tenable's products and beat them up, maim, and torture them, and then tell people about it. And I get to do things like have free drinks for all like Tenable customers or potential customers, and give presentations. So we did that last night. It was a lot of fun. How many people were there last night? Okay, awesome, awesome. It was free beer. It was an easy sell. I'm like, hey, free beer. And everything else I said after that, they were like, what? No, I think, yeah, everyone's just tuned to free beer. So we do this podcast thing, right? A bunch of people, we get together, we talk about stuff, we drink beer, and yeah, there's microphones. As a lot of you know, we do a weekly podcast. You can watch the video, listen to the audio, and go to our website and get all the stuff. And it's all free to download and listen to. Some of my concerns, actually, that I have for podcasting is Apple tends to dictate how people listen to podcasts. And a lot of our listeners use iTunes, and they're changing it. In iOS 6, they force you to use the podcast app. So please, if you listen to podcasts and you're a podcast enthusiast, please don't stop listening to podcasts because Apple's technology sucks. Dogcatcher works great on Android. So like I said, most of you know about the podcast. Any like cigar enthusiasts? We started a cigar podcast. It's awesome, okay? Yeah, so check that out, Stogie Geeks. Okay, that's enough about that. So that's me, and that's John, who said to me before we come out here, don't worry, Paul, I got the DerbyCon slides. It's all set. Thanks, John. So John and I do penetration testing, so I guess I can't make fun of him too much because we collaborate on lots of different kinds of penetration tests. Mostly that means we just drink lots of Red Bull and listen to techno music, but we do we have great teamwork when he's here. See, like I would never attempt a keg stand without John here. So you know, we definitely have great teamwork skills. We work awesome together. As you can see from that picture. And he didn't drop me, so I can't be too hard on John. Just so you know where I stand on very important issues, I know this year's like an election year and stuff, but I've got very important issues that are near and dear to my heart that I feel that I must convey to every audience that I stand out in front of. So most of you are probably reading the slide going, okay, that means Paul likes VI, Python, and really good beer. So who's with me? Yeah! All right. Everyone who didn't raise their hand or clap, you can leave. The doors right in the back. So now's the point where if we're streaming live or we're going to release this later, we might want to stop. So this is some of the research projects. I'll give you a minute to do that, Adrian. Adrian, you can bring us back live now. Yeah. So any questions on that? Okay. So kind of, you know, John's presentation, kind of the theme was, you know, everything they told us about the security was wrong. And I think that along those lines, one of the things that's wrong is how do you ask for a good pen test, right? The folks that created the penetration execution testing standard did a fantastic job. So I've got some slides that are, and that's a really long, a lot of information there and stuff. So in, you know, a couple dozen slides, I wanted to break down for people, like what is a good pen test? How do you get a good pen test? And I'm not gonna go too much into the details of what a good pen test should involve, but when you go procure a pen test, what are the kind of questions you should be asking? And I want people who either do pen tests or get pen tests to understand this so that moving forward we can all get good pen tests and also hopefully perform good pen tests too. So I like to come up with themes for my presentations. So this one's going to mix a lot of themes. So this stuff on good penetration test is Star Wars themed. So there's 6 episodes, which is really, it's kind of lame. But if you like Star Wars, you'll like this part. And then after that, we're going to talk about something that we did in the pen test that was really cool. We found this WordPress server, and actually the vulnerabilities we enumerated, how we exploited them and tied them together, was really interesting. I mean, normally you find a WordPress server, it's like, yeah, whatever, you do your normal WordPress hacking thing. But the way that we tied these small little vulnerabilities together and how it all came together, I thought was really interesting and really kind of exemplified why you want to have a penetration test. Because there's no, or I work for Tenable, right? There's no automated tool that could replicate this level of testing. I did. if that gentleman in the back wants to disclose that it was him, you can ask him more questions about it. I do blame marketing. I do have a bullet that says I blame marketing. So, you know, I wanted to go through some of the mistakes that pen testers make, some questions you got to ask, what you should have in your penetration test, signs you're not ready for a pen test, things you got to do before a pen test, and then a couple things I'll go through quickly on advanced things you can do to mess up pen testers, which pen testers hate it when I talk about that, but I think it's important. Okay, so the phantom menaces of penetration testing. So the mistakes that pen testers make, right? Testing stuff you already know is broken and you have a plan to fix it. And this usually is people's wireless networks. So they're usually like, so do you have a wireless network? They're like, yeah. I'm like, do you have security around it? They're like, not really. I'm like, okay, so that means we don't need to test it. And they're like, what? I'm like, well, if you know it's broken, let me just help, you know, fix it, and then we'll go from there. Relying solely on automated tools, I mean, obviously that should be part of your job, not the whole thing, and we'll see an example of that. We've all heard the thing about, shell is only the beginning, and we'll see hopefully some examples there. Improper scoping, that's, I don't hear a lot of people talk about the proper way to scope a penetration test. And then lame defensive recommendations, right? Your defensive recommendations need to go beyond, hey, you need to install patches. All right, so this speaks to a couple of things within penetration testing, right? And the Death Star is a great example, I think, of what I'm talking about here. I mean, if you know that you have a vulnerability, you don't want us to test it. However, the flip side of that is if you don't have a plan to fix it and you're accepting the risk, this is where pen testing really comes in handy. For example, if you're like, well, we use RDP, or we use Wi-Fi and we applied WEP, and we think WEP's awesome and it's going to protect us, and we accept the risk that WEP provides, or we accept the risk that running RDP to manage our servers provides. And I'm like, well, you really don't understand what the risk is, so why don't you let us test it? And they're like, okay, but we still accept the risk. And of course, the evil empire, I don't know if they knew about that hole where, there's a 2-meter hole that if you get a torpedo through it, the whole Death Star blows up. But there's the holes like that in your network, right? And you don't realize it until someone comes along and tests it, until someone comes along and says, hey, I man and middled your RDP protocols on your network, and I grabbed domain administrator credentials, and then I planted malware on every single system in your environment. And you're like, wow, so that's the risk that RDP bug provides me. Darth Vader's going, oh, that's the risk that 2-meter hole that led right to the reactor that blew up the Death Star. That's what that meant. Damn. All right. So sometimes maybe it's best not to know. That's what I'm saying. You guys know that, some of these slides are not for quite this level of audience, but, scanning's not a penetration test, but, a lot of the things that I want to talk about is intelligence gathering, and we're starting to do a lot more of that, and threat modeling, which I think is really important, and that's one of the things that I think the penetration execution testing standard did for me, was make me understand about threat modeling. And now, we've taken that to a whole new level, and I've got a new person on staff that's doing some of this research for us, and it's really scary. He'll be like, so I completed what I was doing, and here's the Facebook page of the son of the CEO of the company. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, so we're friends with him now on Facebook. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of creepy. But some of the other things too, where I think we need to help in identifying vulnerabilities with intelligence gathering is the financial viability of your company, right? If you can get the overall feel of what's happening in that organization, maybe they're not doing too well in the stock market. Maybe investor confidence is really low, and maybe someone's looking to purchase or acquire your company. Well, if they can convince one of the shareholders that has a majority share or even a large portion of the shares of the company, they can convince them to sell their shares back. Basically, use information that you've gotten from information gathering, say, hey, investor, you should sell your stuff because things are not going well. And he goes, yeah. And he puts stock back in, sells his stock, puts it back in the market. What does that do, right? It's not like I'm not a financial analyst or anything, but it usually drives the price of the stock down. Then competition's going to come in and buy it at a lower price. So with information gathering, you can kind of build scenarios like that, which I thought, that was vulnerabilities that, until a couple of years ago, we really weren't uncovering for places. And I think that's really important. And information gathering and intelligence gathering and threat modeling are extremely important. Yeah, so this is another kind of example on a penetration test, and this has happened a lot. I don't know if this has happened to anyone out there, but I think you need to kind of take a stance on this, is that if you don't want someone to find vulnerabilities in your environment, you shouldn't hire me and a lot of you in the audience, right? Because that's what we do. We find vulnerabilities and we exploit them and we tell you about them. So a lot of times what happens is that's usually like a business unit that's working on closing a big deal for the company. It's a multi-million-dollar deal, and this smaller business unit is all like, yeah, all they say we have to do is we have to have a pen test. Like, you guys can do one of those, right? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, yeah, so we have to provide the results of the pen test to this company that we're about to sign this big deal with, or we don't get the deal. And I'm like, okay, so you want us to find vulnerabilities. Well, you know, they kind of want us to pass the penetration test. Stop right there. That's where you're like, no. That's a bad situation that you're walking into. And we always have this line of questioning, like, so why are you having the penetration test? You know, is there someone requiring that you? Chances are if a third party is requiring this business unit to have a pen test, they don't want you to find vulnerabilities. And you should not walk away from that deal. You should run fast. Okay. So, you know, getting shell, obviously, you know, shell is not the end. You know, access to sensitive information. I'll go through that in my example later. So yeah, scoping a penetration test. This is kind of how people will, you know, try and hide stuff, like droids, for example. And maybe those were the systems you're looking for. However, they're out of scope. Oops. You know, you have to, with your customers, clearly identify the scope. And everything that they're leaving out of scope, that can be a bad thing. And that's really all I'm trying to stay there. Yeah, so like denial, right? They're like, well, we had a pen test. It was awesome. We passed. But, you know, those 12 systems over there, they didn't test those. You know, so it all depends on how you define a pen test and how you scope it. I mean, you could go on thinking that, you know, hey, we had the best pen testers in the world, we passed with flying colors, but yet you left a whole bunch of stuff out of scope. So if you're someone procuring pen tests, try not to leave anything out of scope because it's gonna hurt you in the end, and you're really just in denial. Yeah. So recommendations. You know, I get into this conversation a lot. You know, the pen tester's like, hey, I found this vulnerability. And the customer's like, wow, that's great. So what do we do about it? Well, you should probably apply some patches to your system. Okay, well, that's, you know, maybe the conversation should start when you procure the pen test and say stuff like, well, if you don't have a patch management system and you don't have a process for applying patches on your systems, I probably shouldn't come into your internal network and do a pen test, right? Because it really just means we're going to own a bunch of stuff, and you know, the solution is going to be just apply patches. So you know, you need to go a lot deeper than that. The low, medium, and high rating also, I mean, working in the vulnerability space, I wanted to touch upon this as well. Low, medium, high relate to the vulnerability, not how it affects your organization. So a lot of what we do as pen testers is help you apply that vulnerability information to you, right? We put context around it so that while maybe it's a low vulnerability, it really means something to you, and you need to do something about it. And I'll show you some examples where a whole bunch of like low and medium vulnerabilities. Rick's dancing at me in the back. I thought we were all going to start dancing. You know, a whole bunch of low and medium vulnerabilities led to really bad things. Okay. So let's talk about the questions you should ask of a penetration tester. So really quickly, anyone who is pen testing or anyone who procures pen testing, here are some good questions. You know, if you ask your pen tester, you know, do you prefer to scan dev or QA environments or production, right? The answer is obviously dev and QA, always. Testing production systems is not a good idea. So when you go in and work with your pen tester on setting up scans, you definitely want to make sure that they're willing to test dev and QA environments and not production. If they're like, no, we'll test the production systems, be cautious of that. Also asking about how you scope a web application test is important. what their report format looks like, how you will test the systems that crash if you send them packets, and how you test IPS and incident response, okay? So, like I said, here are the right answers. If someone's coming to scope a web application for you and they're like, oh yeah, just give me the web application and we'll just start testing from there, you're not going to get a good web application test. They have to be asking about the number of fields that your application takes, and more importantly, about the credentials that they're going to have, right? You should be at least asking for 3 sets of credentials. Does anyone know what those should be? Which credentials do you ask for when you test a web application? Anyone? Yes, exactly. So why 2 regular users? Yes. And then why the admin? You're hired. Come give me your business card afterwards, right? Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, so what the gentleman said was 2 users, so you can see if you can go between them, right? Because if we can read each other's bank account information, that's bad. And also, if I can get from regular user to admin. So 3 accounts minimum for web application testing. So that's good if you're procuring a pen test and your pen tester isn't kind of going down that road. You may need to be looking for a different web app pen tester. So also, I think that speaking of scope, right, there's nothing wrong with changing the scope to see what an attacker would see on the inside. I mean, we all know that there is no such thing as a perimeter anymore, right? So everyone's like, well, I want an external pen test. And I'm like, okay, but what if someone gets through your external protections? Then what? Oh, no, we rely solely on our external protections. And I'm like, all right, let's back up a minute. How about this? How about you not pay us to bang on the outside of the doors for a week? And how about you just give us access to a system that's inside? Because let's just say, for example, an attacker were to get on the inside of your network, what would happen then? And they're like, well, we've only paid pen testers to bang on the outside of the door, and they might get into the very end of the pen test and they get shell and they do a happy dance and then we get a report. I'm like, okay. Let's start backwards, right? Let's start from the inside of your network and work out. Give us access to a system. We'll start the pen test from there. We'll uncover all your problems internally, and let's focus on fixing those. Because let's just take into account that someone may phish one of your users successfully, right? Because that never happens. So don't be afraid, pen tester or someone procuring a pen test, to change the scope and think outside of the box. That's totally okay. I'm not saying you have to hire us, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying whoever you're working with, be creative and change the scope, because it can really help you identify what's really wrong in your environment. And the IPS thing is kind of another way of testing, and I'll share our methodology with everyone, again, for those doing pen tests and for those procuring pen tests, right? When you go to talk about, well, we've got an IPS or a WAF, should we leave it on for the test? And the answer is both yes and no. So when we start a test, if someone has an IPS, for example, we start the test with the IPS turned on. We do as much testing as we can until they're able to detect us, right? So we see how stealthy do we have to be, and we just keep kind of escalating our attack slowly until we get picked up by the IPS, right? So that tests your kind of blind weaknesses to your IPS. What can be slipped past it? How much of noise does an attacker have to create before they're tripping an IPS? Once we trip the IPS, we have them turn it off. Then we do the rest of the testing with the IPS off. We find all the vulnerabilities, we exploit all the vulnerabilities that we can, and then we go back and say, okay, now we know what vulnerabilities exist on your systems. Let's turn the IPS back on. Let's take those specific exploits, now let's tune them to slip past your IPS. So that tests everything, I think, very effectively. It tests that your IPS is working. It tests your incident response program in the early phases. It tests the actual vulnerabilities, and then it tests actual bypasses for your IPS in a much shorter time frame, because you've done the testing with the external defenses turned off. Now you're going to take known exploits that work, and you're going to try to slip them past the IPS. So that's a great methodology. Again, if you're procuring pen tests or doing pen tests, that's kind of how I like to do it. Okay, so a little bit about reports, right? The keys to great reports. I mean, that's what the customer's paying for. It's kind of like the key to everyone loving Star Wars that was a teenage boy and saw that, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that you can put in your report to make people love your reports, to love your work, or whatever. There's bullets up there. But anyway, you should tell people like what you did to find the vulnerabilities. Anything that we do for a client, they get to own it at the end, right? If we write a custom script or we have the special technique or we, write an Nmap extension and that was useful in their environment, we document that and we hand the tools over to the customer. And that's part of the report. And I'd say that's probably the number one key to the report, because even if you don't get in, you're still giving the customer something extremely valuable. And there are small percentages where maybe you don't get in because the scope is limited or whatever, but that's a way to provide value. Right? You want to also talk about the impact of the vulnerability and exploitation on the organization. You don't just, again, want to say apply a patch. You want to say, hey, if this happens, we did the threat modeling, and here's how it can play into a scenario, and here's how it would really hurt your organization. And again, information on how to reproduce the condition that kind of goes along with tools. If you find a vulnerability, you need to tell them how to reproduce the checking for that so that when they fix it, they can go back and check it without having to like rehire you a lot to do that. And some clients will hire us back to recheck the vulnerability, but I try and include as much information on how to produce it as well. Okay. The other big takeaway here, and I don't know how many people are doing this, but I think it's important, is I include a section for management response, right? No one's perfect. Everyone's going to have vulnerabilities. It's all about how you handle them. So for every vulnerability that we find, there's a management response. So you get the report, you get to fill in that thing and say, hey, given all the stuff, we accept the risk. That whatever, okay, that's your funeral. If we're going to replace this system or application in 6 months, or we applied a patch for this vulnerability, and then we'll take it back and we'll sign off on it and give you that report. So if an auditor or even internally you want to have documentation about what problems were found and what your plan is to fix them, that should be part of it. Okay. It talked about a little bit about testing your defenses, puts the rubber to the road, blah, blah, blah. We talked about all that. Okay. Now, a new hope for security. And this is the funniest Star Wars graphic I think I've ever seen in my life. Someone had it in a T-shirt at DerbyCon, and I totally want it. I don't even know how it relates to the presentation. I just think it's funny. So it's okay to not be ready for a pen test. And there's a lot of people out there that talk about, well, there's the Nessus monkey and those are bad because all they do is run tools and give people a report. I mean, the fact is some people aren't ready for a pen test. So I think the whole Nessus monkey thing, if you're going to go in, you're going to run an automated tool against someone, and then you're just going to give them the Nessus results. If that organization was really ready for a pen test, you've done them a huge disservice. If you don't know what a vulnerability scanner is and you don't know how to spell Nessus or vulnerability, then yeah, you're going to benefit from just a vulnerability assessment. No, I'm not saying you should just cut the reports right from the scanner itself. You need to include all those report elements I talked about in a previous slide. But, there's some things that we can do, I think, to help people become ready for a pen test. And these are some questions we can ask. Do you have a patch management system? And a lot of people say, yeah, I have WSUS, I got a patch management system. And then you're like, well, how are you attaching Adobe software on your systems? And they're like, what's Adobe software? And you're like, oh, boy. That's bad. Does it encompass all of your systems? Your Windows admins may be like, yeah, this is great. We've got, SCCM, and we are doing third-party software, and we're rocking, doing a great job. But then, your Red Hat guys are like, nah, you're like Bob wrote a script a few years ago, and it sometimes checks for patches. So, you want to make sure you got something like Red Hat Satellite or whatever. And then you want to make sure you have a well-defined process. So this just isn't about applying patches. It's about checking to make sure the patch is actually applied on a continual basis, right? So I wrote a whole article about how patches fall off a system, right? Administrators change stuff. None of your administrators, when they're troubleshooting a problem, have backed out a patch or security change, right? Your systems are in a constant state of flux, so this is a process. So these are some indications you might not be ready. Also a lot of smaller organizations will come to us and ask about security, and they don't have a dedicated person to managing systems or security. And that's kind of a telltale sign that they might not be ready for your for certainly our penetration testing services. I'm like, you're just not ready. Again, I talked about that. Security, a part of your development and QA program. So if people that are writing software, if your developers don't know how to spell SQLI, then you might have a problem, right? I hate to see people that want to pay us a lot of money to look at a web application and their developers don't even know anything about security. They know nothing about cross-site scripting, nothing about SQL injection, and I'm like, look, there's this tool called Burp. You can go buy it for $200. Run that first, maybe send your developers to some training, do some stuff, then hire us to test your web app. Because I just don't think it's fair. Security needs to be part of your development and QA programs. It's probably one of the most important things that folks like Gene Kim have been talking about, improving on your security development processes, is embedding that in your QA programs. Like if QA can have some of the testing tools that we have, they can flesh out that low-hanging fruit, so that when you hire someone to come in to do a pen test, they have to be creative and find the stuff that is really hard to find or really different and outside of the box thinking, okay? So that raises the bar of your pen test if you're finding some of the low-hanging fruit. Another important thing that I always like to preach to is, do you test your software and devices before they go into production? When you get something from a vendor, do you run it through some kind of testing cycle first? And this is really still a sore point for me, because I've been doing embedded security for a long time, and not a lot of people still to this day are taking it seriously. I really think one of the things I wanted to add to the presentation, but I ran short on time, maybe I'll post it to our paul.com website, is a form letter that we can send to the vendors that says, "Dear vendor, I noticed that you sent me a product that had a default previously known username and password for credentials. This is a really bad vulnerability, and you should allow the user to select a username and password before it plugs into the network. The way you're delivering me a product, when I plug it in, it already has a vulnerability. And I refuse to accept this, love," and then you can put your name in there. And maybe we can affect some change. I don't know if a form letter is the right way to go. But we still get stuff that has, default passwords or backdoors. And I think it's interesting, a lot of the Stuxnet stuff, a lot of the some big embedded device hacking events that have happened have gotten some people to take security seriously. I know that because a couple of people called me and was like, so there's always default passwords and people are starting to look bad. We don't want to be in the news. Okay, all right, that's a driver, right? It's not the right one. Maybe we can do some public outreach and get device vendors to properly test their stuff. Even better is give them tools and a program to test their own stuff, because it just comes out of the box with a default password. All right. So now we're going to talk about how the defenders are going to strike back at the attackers and pen testers, and what you can do to get ready for a pen test. This is, I don't know if how much detail I want to go into here. Yeah, I talked about vulnerability scanning. I talked about local patch checking. Passively looking for vulnerabilities. There's a couple of open source technologies. I mean, you can configure Snort to do this. Someone was telling me Bro IDS. Tenable actually has a product that does it. But it's really cool concept if you can pull this off. Because over the network, everything is leaking information about itself, about being vulnerable. So a good example that I'll give is, if you're sniffing all the traffic that's leaving your environment, right? Let's say you've got a policy that says no one can run Firefox on their local system, right? The approved browser is Chrome. No one can run Firefox. Everyone has these kind of policies, or most people do, right? So the user, maybe they really love Firefox, right? They think Mozilla is awesome and they just have to use Firefox, but they can't install it on their system. However, they can open up a virtual machine they can use some kind of even Linux operating system and use Firefox. And they do that, and they get around your defenses. The problem is, for them, if you're passively sniffing the network, you're going to see a user agent string come from that system that's a vulnerable version of Firefox. And they're going to be like, hey, they're violating policy running Firefox. Or someone's running an Apache server that's vulnerable. Or there's a web application that has a piece of JavaScript embedded in it that's distributing malware. And I saw that because I was sniffing the network. So there's tons of advantages of sniffing your network for vulnerabilities. I know there's a couple of kind of open source alternatives. Untenable has a product, but I think it's a great way to look at, you need to network vulnerability scan, you need to passively look for vulnerabilities, then you need to log into all your systems and make sure all the patches are applied. And that's going to prepare you certainly for a pen test, right? The other thing is configuration auditing. Are all my Linux systems configured securely for SSH? I read some articles about how SSH was used to abuse a bunch of systems on a pen test. And I think that the answer to that is making sure you come up with a secure configuration for your systems and then constantly check to make sure they're in compliance. So I'm using compliance there, but not in the traditional evil way where you use that 3-letter acronym. I'm talking about compliance to your own security settings and making sure that, for example, your SSH server is secure, doesn't permit root to log in, only allows keys for authentication and not passwords, and that's important. And you can check for that on your systems with various different methods. I mean, I used to use something called, was it CF Engine, right? Lets you change configuration and check configuration on your systems. That's what I'm talking about there. Undesirable command, we don't need to talk about that. Passive vulnerability, discovery, I talked about that already. Local patch checking. Okay. Antivirus software, right? Now this is more John's thing, and if you guys want to learn more about bypassing antivirus software, John's the man. I mean, kind of heads up all of that research over at paul.com. But we never seem to have a problem bypassing any kind of antivirus ever. And John just does some amazing work. I don't think any of the techniques he's using are groundbreaking or earth-shattering, but it kind of speaks to the scene in The Empire Strikes Back, right? Where they're talking and they're like, the armor's too thick, our blasters can't penetrate it. And that's what people think of antivirus software. They're like, hey, I run antivirus software. That malware, it can't get on my systems. I run antivirus software, right? Now, if you watch the scene closely, or you pay attention to antivirus bypass techniques very closely, you realize the armor really isn't too thick because, well, in the end of the scene of this scene on Hoth, right, they blow up the enemy walkers. But what happened? Wait, the armor's too thick. Okay, just wait a little while, and they're blowing up. Wait, armor's too thick? Nope, they're exploding, right? So that's what we're doing with antivirus software, right? Everyone's like, well, the armor's too thick. And when us, the hackers, are like, well, that's not a problem. We can still blow up your systems, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't have it, but it's not hard to bypass it. And I think it kind of, it's a bad thing if you're a defender and you're relying too much on it. But having a pen test and seeing how you can bypass it, how easily it's bypassed, is a good measure for security, right? Because it could be super easy or it could not be. So I talked about default passwords before. I think, again, it's something you need to check for in your environment, as well as finding open shares. I mean, if you read some of my content in Tenable, I talk about that. Two things that we all really need to check for in preparation for a pen test, right? Like, how many people have been on a pen test and use a default or weak password or an open SMB share to totally own the organization, right? That's the low-hanging fruit that we use, right? Now, it's nice for us because it makes our pen test easy, right? But that's not the goal. The goal is to make sure people get secure, right? That's why we're here. So I really want people that run networks to be able to find those default passwords and open shares on a regular basis. 5 minutes, really? Okay. Wow. Okay. So in 5 minutes, I'm going to go through hacking WordPress in 5 minutes. So this is based on a true story, and I'm going to talk really fast, so brace yourselves. So we found this WordPress server, and I found it by doing some DNS stuff. Did anyone see Carlos's talk on DNS enumeration. Okay, if you didn't, you should, because that was the first step I used. I didn't use Carlos's tool, but I used a similar tool, and I found a blog. Sweet. Okay, so then I said, well, there could be a WAF in front of it, right? Because I was still in the phase of the pen test where active defenses were applying and IPS and WAF were enabled. So I scanned the blog, and it said there's no WAF detected. Now I scanned some other websites, and it said WAF was detected. So I'm like, cool. Blog's hanging out there, flapping in the breeze, right? It's not protected with a WAF. I used WAF with Web Application Firewall Detection tool to do that. Okay. Then I said, well, I'm going to save some time and I'm going to use Nmap, right? Like I could manually test some stuff. I'm like, but Nmap's got a lot of scripts that are awesome. One of the scripts that Nmap has, and I forget the author because I always like to publicly thank him, whoever wrote HTTP WordPress brute force, like I owe you a beer, dude. That's awesome. It brute forces WordPress logins, and it found a login with a username of test and a password of test. Like, that's awesome. I'm now a blogger. Sweet. I've always wanted to be a blogger. So then I logged in, right? And the first thing I see when I log in is, hey, there's a new version of WordPress available. Please notify the administrator. I'm like, yeah, I'll get right on that. As soon as I drop my back door. So it turns out that WordPress was vulnerable to this thing. Now the thing about this vulnerability, right, is in the trackbacks field, I got to put some SQL code, and it's vulnerable to SQL injection. In order to exploit this vulnerability, I have to have a login. I got that, right? I have to make a blog post. I'm like, crap, how am I going to make a blog post without anyone noticing? Like, what am I going to write about? I don't know. I could write about like how I'm hacking your site or something, but that'd probably give me away. So all I did was I backdated my post like a year or two, and it let me publish it, and it ran my SQL code, and no one noticed for like a really long time too, which is pretty funny. And all my posts said was like test. So even if someone did come across it, they might not get suspicious. So once you make that post and you put that SQL code in there, you have to publish it and you have to wait for a WordPress process to run and run your SQL code. When it runs your SQL code, blah, 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 essentially it takes the username and the password hash and it sets it to the title of the post. That's the SQL exploit. You can read more about it on that obscure link right there, right? So the SQL code does that, sets the post title. Hey, look, the admin username and their password hash. I'm like, awesome. I'm like, crap, what the hell do I do with that password hash? That's kind of weird. So yeah, the other thing I did was, well, I'm like, well, the ID field says which username it is. So admin was 1, so I set it to 2, and I got another user. I set the ID field to 3, and I got another user. So I manually did that process like over and over and over again, and enumerated about a dozen users. It was really long and painful process, but I did it because you have to wait for scripts to run in WordPress before it executes your SQL code. So I did all that, and I had about a dozen users. So I didn't necessarily need admin. I just needed someone who was an administrator because I wanted to install a vulnerable WordPress plugin to execute code on the system. So that was my plan. So I cracked the hash. Hash cracking. Basically, here's the command I run. I took all my hashes. I ran them through Hashcat, and lo and behold, I got a user who was an admin because I couldn't crack the admin password in a reasonable amount of time, but there was another user who was admin whose password was cracked much more easily, so I did that, okay? I wrote a text segment on cracking brute force hashes, so you can go read about it there, okay? I logged in as that admin. Now I'm admin. I'm like, sweet, I did another little happy dance. I'm like, but I'm still not done because I really want shell. Right? There was lots of out-of-date plugins, but none of them had like the right vulnerabilities that would work in order for me to get shell. So I said, well, I was going to install a vulnerable WordPress plugin. I'm like, I'm admin. There's tons of vulnerable WordPress plugins. In fact, we're going to have someone on the show that analyzed a bunch of source code in WordPress plugins and found out that it's really crappy. And I'm like, I can't get this exploit to work. It's not, I tried a couple of vulnerable ones. I tried the associated exploits. And then I was like, well, maybe I need to like debug the vulnerable WordPress plugin. And I went into the part of WordPress where you can edit a plugin code and you're editing the PHP code. And I was like looking through the code, and then it dawned on me, dummy, I'm like, if I can go into a plugin and I can edit its code, I can put whatever PHP code I want in here and execute it. So this is my new WordPress plugin. All right. That was so much easier. I just cut right to the chase and put a, command execution. So if anyone wants to download my command execution WordPress plugin, I'll send it to you. So yeah, I did that, and then we were running commands. Yay! Everyone clap after all that. Yay! Okay. So now we're able to run commands after all that, right? I mean, so that was like wicked fun, right? We cracked passwords, we did all this kinds of crazy stuff. We ran commands. If John were here, he would tell you, because after this, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was really tired. And 4 o'clock in the morning is about when John wakes up. So I passed it off to John, and he used it. He installed all kinds of interpreter payloads, bypassed antivirus, escalated privileges, and took the attack from there, which was really great. And that's another, great thing with teamwork too. If you work in a pen test team, make sure you get an opposite schedule. I'm nocturnal. Like, I really think I've messed with my sleep schedule so much now that I'm truly nocturnal. So I gotta drink more caffeinated beverages to stay awake today. So yeah, that's like I said. Yeah, I'm not really a ninja. I just like break stuff with WordPress. That's fun. So if you're running a WAF or IPS, use it to protect all your stuff, remove test accounts. I mean, that's the basic. Make sure if you get this presentation when I send it to you, crackstation.net hashing-security.htm is the best article ever on password hashes and the right way to do it. Some more defensive tips. Don't expose the admin interface, right, ever. Put a WAF around it, secure it, lock it down. Hello? That was...